أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ به من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وقال الله تعالى بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد فإن خير الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل بدعة ضلالة. Today inshallah I will talk about two different ways of behaving, speaking and looking at life around us, which also determines the choices that we make. A positive way of thinking and a negative way of thinking. Now let's look at two verses from the Quran at the very beginning, which tells us that we human beings are very different. We have been given a personality, a set of qualities of behavior which are very different from each other, which also means that we should not be judging people by considering ourselves to be the gold standard. If everybody is like me, everybody talks like me, everybody speaks like me, the world will be perfect. It's not going to happen. So Quran mentions, "Inna sa'yakum lashatta." Your efforts are very different. So we are all chosen. There is a universal script written by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has chosen all of us. He has given us different talents that we utilize. Not everybody in the world will be a professor or a doctor or engineer or dentist. Everybody works differently. And even in the same profession, people work differently. In other words, which I read somewhere, was the most favorite verse of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. قُلْ كُلٌّ يَعْمَلُ عَلَى شَاكِلَتِهِ فَرَبُّكُمْ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ هُوَ أَهْدَى سَبِيلًا. I will give you translation by Muhammad Asad. That everyone acts in a manner peculiar to himself. The word shakila is derived from shakl. Shakl means shape, pattern, template. And your sustainer, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is fully aware as to who has chosen the best path. Which means we have been given a different manner which is peculiar to ourselves. And based upon that we make choices. And mashallah, what choice we have now between the current president and the former president. The world is spinning around. I mean, every day you listen to the radio, the NPR, the CNN or anything, this question comes, what should we do now? What choice do we have to make? And before going with the details of the khutbah, I want to say that we Muslims must get engaged in politics. The choice that we make today will determine the future of our grandchildren. We must be involved. Unfortunately, we have no choice. But anyway. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has endowed us with the gift of speaking and the gift of thinking. We all like to speak, but in order to speak, we also need to think. So the art of thinking must be greater than the art of speaking, but it's only an ideal thing, it's not a realistic thing. People talk without thinking. And particularly for most of us growing up in our own countries, we were not taught or encouraged to even think objectively. We were forced to memorize and accept as absolute truth the thinking and ideas of other men without even considering that they may be wrong. And even now, when people are faced with a problem, they will call their sheikh in their own country and think that what he says is the absolute truth. And this is what Allah wants us to do. And this is something important to remember. There are two ways of thinking. One is a positive way of thinking, which also leads to a positive way of speaking and a positive way of making choices, and a negative way. Wishful thinking is connected with a negative thinking, but I'm not going into that detail. Some people are born optimists, they never lose hope, and some are born pessimists. The way we look at things also depend upon our circumstances at that particular time. For example, as I mentioned, what choice do we have to make? Unless the current president sits down. In a good mood, we enjoy the rain or even a snowstorm. However, when we are depressed, everything looks gloomy, even if it's sunny and nice outside. So similarly, there are two ways of living one's life, a positive way and a negative way. A person who has a positive way of thinking and lives his life in a positive way will not look at a challenging situation as one of doom and gloom. He will turn it into an opportunity and try to get out of it. The Prophet ﷺ was forced to leave Makkah. Did he think that that's the end of it? If you look at a book written by William Muir, Life of Muhammad ﷺ, two parts, Life in Makkah and Life in Medina. And without realizing, he said that Muhammad ﷺ failed at Makkah. He didn't realize that it was, according to him, failure in Makkah that led to success in Medina. The Prophet ﷺ looked at it in a positive way. Yes, I need to do something. If the doors are closing, there must be another door. And hijrah is a very important concept. Not just physical migration, but an intellectual migration as well. And we Muslims are required to make this transition from being just passive observers of American politics to becoming active in engaging it. Just yesterday, elections were held in UK. I just read some highlights that more than 200 Muslims stood in the election. I mean, I don't know how many of them got elected. And the Muslim vote made a huge difference this time too. We need to do that too. So now, what happens when people are faced with a challenging situation? Or when people encounter failures in what they are doing? You can look at it in many different ways, but I look at it in three ways. One is a person who has a negative way of life will say that I cannot do it. I'm a failure. It's too much for me. Another one will say, no, it's a challenge for me. I will rise up to it. I will take it. And the third one will only blame Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's very common in India and Pakistan, Desi community, I'll say in Urdu, Allah hamari sunta hi nahi, which is the statement of kufr, by the way, that Allah doesn't listen to us. Allah listens. He's as-Sami al-Basir. It's just we do not have the patience. We think that only Allah can do things and we have no role to play. That's a different word. The Prophet ﷺ has mentioned, "Kullu nasu yaqdu fa ba'u nafsahu fa mutiquha aw mubiquha." Every day we are faced with this challenge. When we go out, when we wake up, when we go out, we will either relieve ourselves or we will get ourselves into more problems. How we do, how we act. So now I will quote some verses from the Quran to highlight this point. So let's look at the story of Dawood. He was a youngster at that time. He was a thin guy, not a very strong guy. And he was up against Jalut. And this is not in the Quran, the story is in the Quran, but this part is not in the Quran. That someone said that, do you think that a person like you can take on Jalut? He's too big. And Dawood's answer was, if he's too big, then I cannot miss him. See the way he responded to that? Okay, he's big enough, but I can take on him. I will not miss him. And he didn't miss him. Then let's look at the same story as it continues. The story is now about a leader, president, captain of a cricket team or anything that you want. He wants to make sure that the people who are in his team will not back out when the things get tough, or that they are not planted by the establishment who are trying to weaken you from inside. So this is the thing that Talut actually faced when he was appointed by the Nabi of that time, and people had objections. How come he's not a rich guy, he's not a famous person, he holds no position, his father is not a president, his mother is not a kingmaker, how can he be our leader? So obviously from the very beginning he knew that there were people in the army who had not accepted him as a leader. And he doesn't want to go out and fight without first weeding out those people who will actually try to destroy from inside. So what does he do? فَلَمَّا فَصَلَ طَالُوتُ بِالْجُنُودِ قَالَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ مُبْتَلِيكُم بِنَهَرٍ. He comes up with a very smart idea of trying to figure out who are the people with a negative attitude and not with a positive attitude. He wants only those to stay with him who are optimists, not pessimists. So he comes up with this idea and said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will test you with the river. فَمَنْ شَرِبَ مِنْهُ فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي. So I'm telling you, don't drink. If anybody drinks, then he's not from me, which means he's given them an option. You can drink and just walk away. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَطْعَمُ فَإِنَّهُ مِنِّي إِلَّا مَنِ اغْتَرَفَ غُرْفَةً بِيَدِهِ. He doesn't want to be too tough on them. Somebody may be thirsty. So say, except those who just drink a little bit to satisfy their thirst, but otherwise they listen to me, they are my partners, they are going to come with me. فَشَرِبُ مِنْهُ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِنْهُ. So most of them drank except a few. Now there is a rule that you can apply to most situations in life. It's called the 80-20 rule. In any community, there are 20% people who are really dedicated to work, for the masjid too. 80% are just silent observers. If you look at the percentage of people who are voting in an election, it's not 80-20, but it's never 100%. Most of them are just silently sitting on the line, whatever happens. So you can say that maybe 80% drank, 20% didn't. But then what happens? فَلَمَّا جَاوَزَهُ هُوَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مَعَهُ قَالُوا لَا طَاقَةَ لَنَا الْيَوْمَ بِجَالُوتَ وَجُنُودِهِ. So despite the fact that some of them did not drink, they were continuing with him. When they saw Jalut and his army, they said, he can do it. They're too weak. That's the first attitude. So they also left. But what is the characteristic of people who have positive way of thinking? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes, قَالَ الَّذِينَ يَظُنُّونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُلَاقُو اللَّهِ كَمْ مِنْ فِيَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِيَةً كَثِيرَةً بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. Those who really had the thought of meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a true optimist, they say, how many times history tells us that a small army has overcome a much bigger army with Allah's permission. We Muslims are not fewer in number in the world. We may be fewer in America, maybe 8 to 10 million. But there are other communities who are much less than what we are, much less privileged 100 years ago, who are now ruling the country. Why are we not doing this? We have to ask ourselves this question. So they looked at this thing, okay, we are small in number, but we have belief in Allah. And if you have belief in Allah, what else do you need? Another example which comes from Surah Al-Ma'idah, from Bani Israel again, and this is historically proven too, that when Musa ﷺ and his people had crossed the river, they were in the desert of Sinai, and all the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were coming down to us, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked them to do one thing. So Musa ﷺ said, Ya qawmi udkhulul ardal muqaddasata allati kataba Allahu lakum. O my people, enter the blessed holy land. Allah has already written it for you. Now what other guarantee can you do that? If an angel comes down and say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, after the prayer, go and invest in that particular stock, it will develop tomorrow. Everybody will do that. It's the Prophet, the Rasul of the time telling them, Allah has already written for you. The only thing you have to do is just enter. What could be simpler than that? وَلَا تَرْتَدُوا عَلَىٰ أَدْبَارِكُمْ فَتَنْقَلِبُوا خَاسِرِينَ. But if you turn back, you will be the losers. Okay, so success is guaranteed unless you do something different. So if you believe in Allah, success is guaranteed, whether it will be in this world or in the hereafter. It's guaranteed. قَالُوا يَا مُوسَى إِنَّ فِيهَا قَوْمًا جَبَّارِينَ. They said, O Musa, in that land there are people who are called Jabbarin. According to some historians, they were called Philistines, who come from somewhere from Eastern Europe, and they were causing a lot of trouble at that time. They were really very powerful. Even Pharaoh was not able to overcome them. وَإِنَّا لَن نَدْخُلَهَا حَتَّى يَخْرُجُ مِنْهَا فَإِنْ يَخْرُجُ مِنْهَا فَإِنَّا دَاخِلُونَ. We'll just wait here. Once they get out, then we'll get inside. Not otherwise. We're not going to do that. And what kind of logic is this when the Prophet is telling Allah has already written for you, just enter it. No, we're not going to enter until they get out. That's the way of thinking that I'm highlighting. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now gives us an example of the opposite mindset. قَالَ رَجُلَانِ. Only two people. Yet it's not even 80-20. It's like, according to the Bible, the people who migrated with Musa ﷺ were 6 million people. Sheikh Maududi has questioned this number, but you can still imagine that there must have been in hundreds of thousands. And out of that, 2, not even 20%. قَالَ رَجُلَانِ مِنَ الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ. The 2 people who really feared to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the verse says, if you don't do it, you will be losers. They are fearing that part. not fearing the Jabbareen. He said, Anamallahu alayhima. Allah had blessed upon them. Allah had given them the intellect, the shakila, to look at things in a positive way. So he said, Udkhulu يخافون أن الله عليهم ادخلوا عليهم الباب فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون وعلى الله فتوكلوا إن كنتم مؤمنين. They are questioning the iman of the people by saying, Allah has already told you to just go in. As soon as you enter the door, you will be victorious. Because this is Allah's promise. Have faith in Him if you claim to be believers. So here we have to look at it that in every situation that we face in life, we don't have a messenger who will come and tell us, we don't have an angel who will come and tell us. But the Quran tells us that whenever you are facing a challenge, consider it to be an opportunity. Believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at it positively and make the right choice, inshallah. The third example that I want to give you is from the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it happened at the time of the Battle of Ahzab, when everyone against Islam had gathered together. We don't know how many people, maybe 10,000 or more people were marching towards Medina. And there were people from inside the Medina with a negative mindset. They told the believers, الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسُ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَاخْشَوْهُمْ. You see, thousands of people have gathered together. They are going to attack you, so fear them. Not fear Allah, fear them. And the answer was, فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. The only thing it did was increase their iman. It's not the numbers, it's the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They said, وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. We know they are great in number, but we also know that Allah is enough for us. He's our protector. So that's the kind of mindset that the Quran is also building up through the stories that we read in the Quran, that we have to apply in our own life. The second one is, it's somebody else's fault. And I will title it as to accuse or to excuse. It happens in our daily life at home, something goes wrong. Dad, it's your fault. Mom, it's your fault. Or the wife will blame husband, or the husband will blame the wife. And it happens at workplace, where everybody is competing with each other and nobody is anybody's friend, I can tell you, in a workplace. One of my professors told me that working in corporate America is like swimming with the sharks. The sharks are going to attack you. You have to be careful. You have to be strong enough. You have to become a bigger shark in order to avoid being bitten by a shark. But here also it happens that when you're working, like for example in my field, there are secretaries, there are old, some of them, there are nurses. Everybody has their own story. Somebody is not performing well. Something goes wrong. Instead of blaming and accusing, try to find some excuse. Maybe that person is having what they say in American language, a bad hair day. Maybe that person is sick. Maybe they have a family member who's sick. Maybe they are having some trouble. The idea is not to push them down, but to bring them up, to support them. That's the positive way. If you're negative, somebody is wrong. It's never my fault, it's somebody else's fault. You will never be a good leader. Even at your workplace, or if you have your own business, you're running your own practice, you have to be careful. Try to be calm and compassionate with people. There's something said that إِذَا بَلَغَ أَنْ أَخِيكَ شَيْئًا تُقْرِهُ فَالْتَمِسْ لَهُ الْعُذْرَ جَوْدِكَ وَإِنْ لَمْ تَجِدْ لَهُ عُذْرًا فَقُلْ فِي نَفْسِكَ لَعَلَّ لِأَخِي عُذْرًا لَا أَعْلَمُهُ. That when something bad has happened that you don't like at your workplace, home, anywhere, then just think that my brother has an excuse. Now find an excuse for someone. If you cannot find, then think that he or she has an excuse. It's just, I don't know that. This is, for me, it's a very, like an eye-opener for me in my workplace. How to change my own attitude when dealing with my staff. How can I, instead of accusing and blaming them for everything, bring them around, hold their hand, and take them to a level that I want. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولذكر الله أكبر. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. The third part, let's go through all three things. First is, I cannot do it. That's self-defeating attitude. The second is not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. You will never rectify the situation. The third is Allah in a negative way. And it's called su'zan billah, to have the wrong idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That no, Allah has written it for me, it will happen. No. Hasan al-Basri says, Innal mu'minu asana zanna bi rabbihi fa asana al-amala wa anna al-fajira asa zanna bi rabbihi fa asa al-amala. What we think determines how we act. So he says that the true believer always has positive thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that attitude leads him to act in the best possible manner. On the other hand, a fajr has a negative thought process about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which translates into him doing something which is bad, which Allah doesn't like it. So if you think good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm going through this tough situation, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِذِ ابْتَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ رَبُّهُ بِكَلِمَاتٍ فَأَتَمَّهُنَّ قَالَ إِنِّي جَاعِلُكَ لِلنَّاسِ إِمَامًا. You look at the stories of the prophets, there is a hadith that the higher your level, the greater will be the degree of trial that you will face. And these prophets faced much more than we have faced, and yet they stood through it. They never lost hope. That's one thing. وَلِهَذَا جَاءَ فِي الْخَبَرِ حُسْنُ الظَّنِّ مِنْ حُسْنُ الْعِبَادَةِ. Having a good thought, positive thought about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually the beauty of worship. It's a beautiful way of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّمَا يُحْسِنُ بِاللَّهِ الظَّنَّ من حسن عمله فكأنه قال آسنوا أعمالكم يحسن ظنكم بالله فإن من ساء عمله ساء ظنه, which is basically the same thought process, that keep doing the best, think well, do well, and that will lead to a good thought process about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. And we should also think that Allah Jawadun Kareemun La akhudana Allah biswi af'alina wala wakilna illa ila husni amalina bi rahmatihi. That Allah is too gracious. We hope to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that even though sometimes as human beings we have negative thought process, that He will not hold us to accountability because of that. And we should not just trust only that our action is good, but we have to have good thought process about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Amal and thought process both go hand in hand. And one should never lose hope. Another story that I want to talk about is the story of Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam. His husnul zan bin Allah. It's been decades that Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam was missing, and then his younger brother Binyamin was also missing. And yet he tells his son, Ya buniyya zabu fatahassasu min Yusufa wa akhihi. My children, 10 of them, go and start looking for your brothers, Yusuf and his brother. And they think, what are you talking about? They must be dead by now. But he says, Wala taisu min ruhillah. Never lose hope. Inna ulla yaisu min ruhillah illa al-qawmul kafirun. Only those people who do not really believe lose hope from Allah. They are the husnul zan. He never lost hope that Allah will always bring His son back to him. And He did it. So some of the lessons that I want to highlight before going that Brother Rafai and Khalid Sadozi are not here, but they told me to make an announcement that the masjid, the roof needs to be repaired before the end of this summer. So far we have collected only $10,000. The estimated cost is about $64,000. We are not going to get it from government, any grant. We are trying, but we hope that people will donate generously to us today and in future, so that we have enough money to start this process. We don't want this roof to start leaking. So the lessons to learn are that avoid knee-jerk reaction whenever we face a tough situation. Think before speaking, look before leaping, plan before responding. And we should think in more than one dimension. And we choose the lesser of the two evils. And here I want to quote Shaykhul Islam Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. Laysul aqilul ladhi ya'lamul khayra min ash-shar. A person who can distinguish what is right from what is wrong, what is good from bad, is not the one who's really smart. Okay. Seems paradoxical. But it says, وَإِنَّمَا الْعَاقِلُ الَّذِي يَعْلَمُ خَيْرَ الْخَيْرَيْنِ وَشَرَّ الشَّرَّيْنِ. A truly smart person is one who knows the better of the two good options and who knows the lesser of the two evils. I will read it again in Arabic. Think about it. لَيْسَ الْعَاقِلُ الَّذِي يَعْلَمُ الْخَيْرَ مِنَ الشَّرِّ وَإِنَّمَا الْعَاقِلُ الَّذِي يَعْلَمُ خَيْرَ الْخَيْرَيْنِ وَالشَّرَّ الْشَرَّيْنِ. If you find one option, there's one option, try to see, is there a better option? And if you're faced with a tough situation, you have to think we don't live in an idealistic world. We need in a realistic world. Most of the choices that we make, unfortunately, are between what is bad and what is worse. There's nothing good for Muslims that seems like that. Or for America right now. People are laughing at us. What's going on? So, وَيَعْلَمُ أَنَّ الشَّرِيَةَ مَبْنَاهَا عَلَى تَحْصِيلِ الْمَصَالِحِ وَتَكْمِيلِهَا وَتَعْطِيلِ الْمَفَاسِدِ وَتَقْلِيلِهَا. That the Sharia's idea is that you find what is a better option, what will lead to good, and then go ahead and complete it. And if you find that something is bad, if you can avoid it, avoid it. If you cannot avoid it, minimize it. Taqleel. So we have two options here, unless something changes. One is incompetent, the other lies in the face of billions of people. Is this what this country of 330 people have to offer for its leadership, top leadership, basically the leadership of the world? I don't know. So true belief is reflected in our positive approach, which will eventually lead us to make the right choices. And if you cannot make the best choice, at least choose the lesser of the two evils. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَيْتَنَا وَهَبْ لَنَا مِن لَّدُنكَ رَحْمَةً إِنَّكَ أَنتَ الْوَهَّابُ. We make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have chosen to come and live in this country. But once we are in this country, we should be more concerned about where our grandchildren will be living than where our parents are born, are buried. You know, we have to look at the future. And we are living in the present. We have the past, but the past is of no use if we just live in the past. We have to live in the present with an eye on the future. And we hope that 50 years from now, America will have better leaders, and the Muslim community will be in a much better position than it is today. Despite our numbers, we are very weak, and we should not just keep sitting hoping that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send angels to fight for us. We have to raise ourselves to economic superiority, to technical skill of a level where others look at us. That will come through education, through allocating our resources to education, to technology, to bringing our generation to a level where they can be competitive, where they become world leaders. And make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that our generations are world leaders. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ. Ibrahim is here. Okay.